My name is Emily Tan, and I will be your host in the next hour. We are very excited to be having this webinar today, which publicizes the steel guidance which the SBTi has developed and launched in July this year. The steel sector project actually began in November of 2021 and allows companies in this sector to set 1.5-degree aligned science-based targets for the first time. So thank you for joining us on this milestone. We would like to thank participants for sending in your questions ahead of time, and we will try our best to answer them within the context of the presentations, but otherwise we will take more questions in the Q&A section at the end. Next slide, please. So before we start, here are a few guidelines for everyone. So as you can tell, this is a Zoom webinar, so your camera and microphone are automatically muted. If you have questions, please send them through the Q&A button, which has been activated. So slides from this webinar will be shared after the call. And it is also recorded for the benefit of those who cannot join us live today. Next slide, please. So very exciting. This is the agenda for today. So we have scheduled an hour in total, but we expect to get through the content in a lot less time than that, so we can leave some room for Q&A at the end. So we will have some opening remarks from our Chief Technical Officer, Alberto, and then move on to provide an overview of the SBTi and an explanation of what science-based targets are. Including some information about our collaboration with Mission Possible Partnership, or MPP. Then SBTi staff will, and our technical partner for the project, Energy Transitions Commission, or ETC, will present our project on steel around what the guidance we have been developing covers. And finally, we will close off with a Q&A session and some closing remarks. Next slide, please. So before we get started, let's have a bit of a quick poll to understand who our audience is today. So we want to know what kind of organization you represent. And while the poll is running, I'm pleased to introduce the team working on today's webinar. So on the screen, you can see Carl Downey is the head of sector development at SBTi, and he oversees all our sector projects. We also have Brenda Chan, who is technical manager at the SBTi, and she leads on the work on steel. And we also have Rafael Malinowski, who is project manager at ETC, or Energy Transitions Commission, our technical partner for this steel project. So I will moderate the Q&A sessions, but I also want to thank my colleagues working behind the scenes on this project, as well as on this webinar, Amir Khan and Paulina Moreno. It is thanks to their work that this webinar is taking place. And with that, thank you so much for taking part in the poll. We shall close the first poll and see who we have here today. So great, many of you are coming from the industry. We have a good amount of consultants and industry associations, as well as NGOs. So welcome everyone. And without further ado, let's move on to the content. Let's see the next slide. So to provide us with the opening remarks, we will, before we do that, let's move on to the second poll, because we are very curious. We want to know, where is your organization based? So if we can have the poll up, are you from Africa, Asia, Europe, North or South America, or Oceania? And if you're joining us from Oceania or Asia, so thank you so much for joining us, because I know it's quite late for you. So please feel free to take part in the poll. And as you do that, I would like to introduce our first speaker. So Alberto Carrillo Pineda is our Chief Technical Officer. Unfortunately, he is unable to join us live, but he has kindly pre-recorded a video, which we will play now.
Thank you and welcome everyone. I'm not able to be with you today live since I'm attending Climate Week in New York City. However, I'm really excited to share this message with you on this day in which we're unveiling an important milestone for SBTi and in our efforts to decarbonize the steel industry. In a world where we're already feeling the devastating impacts of climate change, it is imperative to take urgent action to reduce emissions. If the private sector wants to remain competitive in a transitioning world, it is critical for companies to set science-based targets. And as you know, virtually every company can already go through this process. However, in recognition of the fact that it is critical to ensure that targets are adopted in a robust and standardized way, SBTi has developed guidance for multiple sectors. Today, we have guidance for 14 different sectors. Last year, we released guidance for 3 sectors, including the forest, land use, and agriculture sector, the cement sector, and the maritime sector that together represent 30% of global emissions. This summer, we released a draft steel guidance and tool, and we are today officially launching this guidance, which provides the first framework for science-based decarbonization in the iron and steel making industry. The role of the steel sector is critical to our economy, to our infrastructure, and to the climate, as it accounts for up to 9% of global emissions. This is why this framework is so important and why it's so important for companies in the sector to set science-based emission reduction targets. Before I hand it over to the steel team for the presentation of the guidance, I want to congratulate the team for their incredible work over the past 2 years to get this project completed. This was possible thanks to the contribution from multiple stakeholders and multiple experts from academia, civil society, scientists, and businesses that played a critical role in shaping this guidance. And I also want to acknowledge the critical contribution of our partner, Mission Possible Partnership, that made this guidance feasible. Finally, I want to thank all of you that participated throughout this process and that contributed with critical input for the development of the guidance. To cut emissions, strengthen investor confidence, remain competitive, and build resilience in the face of a changing economy, the solution is clear. Steel companies must show leadership by setting ambitious science-based targets. Now I'll hand over to the team to kick us off. Thank you.
Great. And so with that, I would like to now close our second poll to see the results. And great, majority of our attendees are coming from Europe, or your organization is based in Europe, I mean, with a good representation from Asia as well as North America. So thank you so much once again. And at this point, I would like to hand the metaphorical microphone over to my colleague, Carl, who will take us over the overview. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Emily, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. So in this section, I'm just going to give a brief introduction to who SBTi is and what science-based targets are, and then a little bit about the project on steel. So for those of you who don't know us, SBTi, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, we exist to encourage companies to take ambitious climate action by setting climate targets that are aligned with the latest climate science. And we do that with our 5 founding partners that you can see on the slide. And we do this with 2 main ways. One is by developing resources so companies can understand the level of ambition, the level of emission reduction needed for their particular case. And then we also have a separate independent validation service of company targets. On the next slide, you can see a little bit of the progress that we've made to date. We have over 3,000 companies already setting science-based targets. And we've nearly 6,000 companies if we include those both who have set targets already and those who are committed to set targets. And it's also worth knowing that we've reached a key milestone, which is a critical mass of over 20% of high impact companies who set targets in many sectors and across many regions. So this shows that SBTs are really becoming mainstream. So that's a little bit about SBTi. Now I just want to give an introduction to what science-based targets actually are, which is relevant to understand the details that we will go into later on steel. So our net zero standard lays out the full framework. And it describes how long-term net zero targets are made up of these 4 elements that you can see in the slide. So the first one is a 1.5 degree aligned near-term target. So that's a target with a time frame of 5 to 10 years. And we're going to see in a few moments what that looks like for steel. The second element is the long-term target itself. So that's a target to reduce emissions to a residual level by 2050 or sooner. So that's an over 90% reduction compared to today's emissions. Then the third element on the screen is something that we call beyond value chain mitigation. And it's optional. It's outside the scope of your science-based target. So science-based targets should be based on real emission reductions within the value chain. So that means they cannot rely on offsets or compensation. But that doesn't mean that those kind of actions beyond the value chain don't have value. They can help reduce emissions in other parts of the economy, and therefore companies may wish to embark on them as a voluntary additional action. And then the fourth and final part that you can see on the slide is obligatory, and it's when a company reaches its very low emissions level at the long-term target, it must further commit to reducing those residual emissions to reach net zero through permanent removals from the atmosphere. And it's also worth knowing that if you set a long-term net zero target, you must have a near-term element as shown here. But if you want to set only a near-term target, that's also still possible. So that's the general framework. Now I just want to talk a little bit about how companies should calculate how much they need to reduce emissions, especially for their near-term target and for their specific case. So in SBTi, we use two main target setting methods for companies' emissions, so for their scope 1 and 2 emissions. The first one on the left-hand side of this slide, it's used for large homogeneous sectors. So that's the case with steel that we're discussing today. And with this method, companies are expected to converge towards a sector decarbonization pathway, which is expressed in terms of carbon intensity. So in this case, for steel, it's tons of CO2 per ton of steel. And what's interesting about this convergence approach, it means that not all companies' targets will be the same, because they in fact depend on the company's individual case and their starting emissions. So we refer to this method as the sectoral decarbonization approach. So it's why you might hear us talking later in the webinar about the SDA when we're talking about the steel-specific methods. And in a few moments, you'll hear from Rafal, who'll talk about the carbon intensity pathways for steel and how these were selected. And these are the pathways that use this method. And then the other method, which is shown on the right-hand side of the slide, is used for all other sectors or all other sources of emissions. And it's called cross-sector absolute reduction or absolute contraction. And it expects all companies to reduce their emissions at the same linear annual rate of 4.2% over 2020 to 2030. And it's used when no sector method exists. So that was a short introduction to SBTi and to SBTs. Now I'm going to move on to the steel guidance and the development process. But before I do that, it falls to me to open the third poll of this webinar. And this poll asks the question, what's the status of your company with respect to SBTi? So that poll has been open now. We leave it open for a few moments. And in the meantime, I'm going to continue and I'm going to talk about how the steel guidance was developed. So on the next slide, just a few important points about the development of this guidance. You've already heard some of this already about the timing and so on. So I'm just going to emphasize one or two things here. One is that, like with all SBTi projects, we have an expert advisory group that accompanies the project. You can see the members of the group on the screen. They're deliberately a group chosen to make a diverse mix of companies, industry, and in this case, from different parts of the steel industry, and then also NGOs and academia, and also with a good global diverse balance. It's important to know that the expert advisory group does not have a governance role. They don't take decisions, but they have an advisory role in the development of the guidance. Then we also ran a 60-day public consultation earlier this year to get feedback from the wider community. And then, as was already said, we published the steel guidance in July, so 2 months ago. In terms of how we technically developed the resources, on the next slide, I want to point out our important partnership that we have SBTi with MPP, the Mission Possible Partnership. So MPP is an alliance of climate leaders focused on efforts to decarbonize the highest emitting industries. And they do this partially through detailed technology roadmaps for these sectors. We announced a partnership last year, and in this partnership, we intend to work together on these heavy emitting sectors to align where possible and to use the detailed modeling work that MPP has already developed for these different sectors. So this doesn't mean that SBTi would automatically endorse all of MPP's sector pathways, but this will be done more case by case. And here's a case in point. The steel sector is the first sector guidance where we've worked hand in hand with MPP, because our technical partner, ETC, who you will hear from, the Energy Transitions Commission, who you will hear from in a moment. They're part of MPP, and they were able to use the detailed modeling already done as part of MPP on the steel sector as the basis to develop the pathways that we needed for our target setting methods. So then just a couple more slides on what we were aiming to cover in this guidance when we initiated the project. So the guidance aims to do what all of our sector guidances do, which is two main things. One is to interpret the carbon budget for the sector and for individual companies by providing 1.5 degree aligned pathways. And Rafal will talk a little bit more about this in a moment. And then the second thing that it does is it provides the greenhouse gas accounting and the target setting guidance that companies need to understand what they need to do for their individual case to set targets. And Brenda will talk a little bit more about this in a moment. And then my last slide, by way of introduction on what we're trying to cover here, is about who the guidance is actually aimed at. So its main audience is the iron and steel makers themselves. So these companies will have the most significant emissions from the sector within their own operations, within their own scope 1 and 2, and to a certain extent scope 3. And then the guidance also gives guidance to companies upstream and downstream of these producers so that they can also set targets. And that would be either using the cross-sector methods where relevant or using the steel sector pathway if that's relevant for covering part of their scope 3 emissions, for example. So with that, I'm finished my introduction to the project, and I'll hand back to Emily.
Thank you so much, Carl. And let's see what the poll results are for where everyone is at in terms of, science-based targets. So I see, a number of companies have committed and are considering to set science-based targets. And there are a good number of companies that are not represented here, but yeah, I think, the trend is really quite consistent with the findings from our 2022 monitoring report, which gives insights on, the status of adoption across the different major indices across the G7 countries, which I very much encourage you to check out on the SBTi website. And with that, to take us through the pathways and core boundaries, I would like to invite Rafal from ETC to come online and take us through it. Rafal, please.
Thank you very much, Emily. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. I will have a pleasure to take you through some of the core features of our methodology. And yeah, so let's get going. Next slide, please. So there are three main features, and they are not mutually exclusive. They actually build upon each other. So we are going to speak about fixed system boundary. And by system boundary, we mean set of processes and their emissions, which are accounted for in the boundary of which we assume to be attributed to the steel industry. We are going to speak about how we split the pathways between the ore-based and scrap-based steel production in order to recognize the vastly different challenges that they face and sort of the decarbonization trajectory. And then we are going to speak about how companies move between these pathways in a scrap input dependent way, and yeah, how it feeds into the just transition and distribution of scrap around the world. With that, let's move on to the pathways that we have reviewed as part of the effort. Next slide, please. So we have looked at many of the pathways in order to select the reference pathway, because the total budget and emission trajectory are crucial inputs into the SBTi methodology. And thus we wanted to take a look at, well, what is around and which pathway meets the criteria of SBTi, the example of plausibility of the pathway, but also of the ambition level. And what we have found is that these pathways differ quite a lot when it comes to their 2030 and 50 emissions, which is of course expected because they differ when it comes to their assumptions on the technology availability and model optimization logic. But what we also found is that 2020 values very significantly. And it's not that someone made a mistake. It's because these scenarios use different system boundaries. And in order to, we had to settle on something to provide a credible and robust guidance for the companies. So let's move on to the next slide, which is going to show us what is the core boundary. So first of all, why did we do it like that? What do we mean by core boundary? And the idea behind the core boundary is that companies, if we take a look at traditional GHG protocol scope 1, 2, and 3, it is of course a great framework, but the issue with that when applied to the steel sector is that companies can quite easily move in that space their emissions from scope 1 to scope 3, because in example, the most emission intense part of the whole value chain is the iron making. And it is possible to purchase iron from other companies in the market, which means that suddenly these emissions move from my scope 1 into my scope 3. So the idea behind the fixed boundary is that regardless of who owns given process in my value chain, I still account for these emissions. So in example, we can see that there is power production in the boundary. So I account for these emissions as part of my emissions, regardless of where I buy these emissions, where I buy the power from, whether I make power or not. And there has been quite a big discussion on whether to include upstream fossil fuel related emissions, because there is still quite large data uncertainty around them, right? So they are not methane emissions from coal mining, especially met coal mining. They are not as well understood as well as the CO2 emissions from the steel making. So we made the decision that we are not going to include that in the boundary for now, but we proposed mandatory scope 3 target instead. So mandatory scope 3 target, it does not require to cover, let's say, 95% of these emissions. So it allows some room for the errors that are or large margin of error surrounding the emission factors used for the upstream fossil fuels. And when it comes to downstream processing, we put the line at the hot rolling because it is the last emission intense step shared by vast majority of steel products. And you will see that many other organizations use different core boundaries, and the main driver of the differences between these boundaries is the goal of the methodology. So our goal is to drive sector level decarbonization through the lens of the company. And if we look at sector level emissions, hot rolling is still a sizable chunk of emissions, while cold rolling, not necessarily. And on the other hand, if we look at the product level, cold rolling and coating and all the subsequent steps are also can be quite important for the emission intensity of the given product. So it's just that it's not that someone makes a mistake in that regard. It's that there are different goals of these boundaries and methodologies. Probably at some point in the future, we can expect convergence of all these boundaries towards a certain standard. But as of now, there are still some differences that have to be accounted for. Next slide, please. So after long discussions, we have made a decision that we are going to select IEA NZT pathway as our reference pathway. But we had to adjust boundary. And the main reason for that is that IEA includes emissions from the power plants integrated with blast furnaces within steel factories as emissions from the power sector. While we believe that attributing these emissions to the steel sector is more robust solution, because in example, let's say that the power plant that provides power to a steel plant wants to decarbonize and wants to switch to any of the low carbon solutions. And suddenly the off gases from the steel plant, which have been used in that power plant, like they don't disappear because because the power plant switched to renewable power, in example. So we believe that it is more prudent to attribute these emissions to the steel industry. And this is, of course, one pathway. And let's take a look at what we did with those pathways to make it more fit for the purpose of the guidance. So let's move to the next slide. So ore-based and scrap-based production, there's huge overlap between the products that they provide to the market. You could almost say that their product slate is the same or could be the same, accounting for some differences maybe in quality or some difficulties around it, but it is possible to produce high quality steel with scrap. So we had to, but in terms of their emission intensity and the decarbonization pathway that they likely look at, there is quite a big divergence. So in order to account for that, we split the scrap-based pathway from the general pathway. And if you take a look on the right-hand side, you can see that the total sum of the budget allocated to the steel sector did not change with this treatment. It's just that we recognize that there are two pathways that are going to shape the industry. And what is important is that steel companies are unfortunately quite complex beasts, and almost none of the steel production is 100% ore-based or 100% scrap-based. Therefore, we had to somehow account for the fact that they can move between those two lines, and which caused many discussions. And after many discussions, we landed on a treatment which we are going to see on the next slide. So this is maybe a bit complex slide. But bear with me for a second. So the red line shows the development of the ore-based production emission intensity, like the reference pathway that shapes the pathways for any company. And what we did is that we assumed a static pathway for this 100% scrap-based production. If you take a look at the bottom, you can see there's like a straight line, which, to the best of our understanding, should be achievable by the scrap-based production, relatively easy compared with ore-based production, because the investments required to decarbonize ore-based production are simply few times larger, and the obstacles there are also much bigger because of that. And what you can see is that if we increase availability of the scrap in the system, suddenly the whole ore-based trajectory moves up. So it becomes easier for companies to meet the target because the emission intensity target shrinks. And the benefit is not attributed to one company, it's attributed to the whole sector. Because of historical developments, the distribution of scrap around the world is quite uneven. There are still countries that develop their own steel stock. So we thought that in this way, we are going to promote action by all the actors in the market, rather than just those that already have access to scrap. So if you take a look, like both scrap-based producers and ore-based producers have to decarbonize, but at a different pace. So the pace for scrap-based producers is much slower than for ore-based producers. So I already mentioned that we provide the benefit to the whole sector. We spread the benefit across all companies operating in the sector. So when it comes to company level target setting, and if we move to the next slide, you are going to see what happens. So the emission intensity pathway is different if the company changes its scrap use over the target period. And the reason is that the scrap availability in the system and the increase in scrap availability in the world is already accounted for in the global pathway, and the pathway that impacts the shape of the pathway for the company. So if then the full benefit of the scrap would be then attributed to this single company, then we would basically double count the benefit. The benefit is already there at the global level, at the sector level, and thus if the company taps into this pool of scrap, which allows immediately lower emission intensity production, then the target adjusts to show that, and to also keep the to ensure that regardless of the feedstock that the company uses, that the plant uses, it still has to decarbonize its underlying assets. So there is no way in which company, and under this methodology, there is no way in which company could meet its science-based target without decarbonizing underlying assets, or at least we believe that the methodology prevents such situations. So to recap, if we move to the next slide, there is fixed system boundary that ensures that all material on a sector level, emission sources are covered, and they are covered regardless of the asset ownership. So we are going here a bit beyond the traditional scope 1, 2, and 3 to ensure that the system can be played, really. And the reference pathway was selected based on multiple expert interactions and adjusted to the core boundary which we landed on. And it had to be split into ore-based and scrap-based reference pathways to recognize that that they contribute different amounts of emissions to the system, and scrap-based production is actually preferred. Therefore, its trajectory is easier to meet. The target should be easier to meet for scrap-based producers than for ore-based production. And in the end, also there is the idea of dependency on the scrap input, because we treat scrap as the global good, common good. Its benefits and increase of the scrap availability is recognized at the sector level rather than company level, which means that in the end, when company increases its scrap production, its scrap consumption, that the target has to adjust to not double count the benefit. Thank you very much. I hope that was clear, and if not, we will tackle some of the issues at the Q&A and maybe further interactions. With that, let me thank you and hand over back to Emily. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rafael, for taking us over all the technical aspects of the guidance. And now, speaking on the criteria and target setting methods, I'll hand over to my colleague Brenda, who will cover this section.
Thank you, Emily. Hello, everyone. I'm going to provide some target setting guidance, including target wording, some criteria, and also recommendation. According to our methodology, the target changes depends on the starting emissions and the scrap input. On the slide here, we can see some example of different companies with varying starting emission intensity, but also different scrap shares, and how they have to meet the reduction targets. For example, for 100% ore-based, scrap-based producer, like company A, with a base year intensity of 0.5 ton CO2 per ton of hot rolled steel, the required intensity reduction will be around 26%, whereas company C, with 0% scrap intensity of 2.5 tons CO2 per ton of steel, will require intensity reduction of 29% in the target year. This assumes that there's no scrap change in the target year. However, company E is also 0% scrap base, which is 100% ore base company. Both have the same starting point, which is 2.5 tons CO2 per ton of steel as company C. But company E is intending to increase their scrap input from 0 to 20%, and so it has a steeper target of 40% intensity reduction in the target year, for the reason Rafael has explained it before. Can I have the next slide, please? So as explained in the last slide, the calculation of the target differ greatly, depends on whether the company's scrap input is growing. We found that it is necessary to include this information in the target wording to be transparent and robust. from a stakeholder perspective. Therefore, an example target for company E could be company E commits to reduce scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions covered by the iron and steel core boundary, 35%, for example, per ton of hot rolled steel by 2030 from a 2020 base year. As the target calculation depends on the scrap ratio projection, Company E will publish the scrap ratio associated with this target annually, starting from the base year. We also provide example of how target covering emissions falling outside the core boundary must be set. The target wording can be Company E also commits to reduce all other scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emission 42% over the same time frame. For other scope 3 target, we have this wording is Company E further commits to reduce scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions from fuel and energy related emissions 25% over the same time frame. So these are the example. Can I have the next slide, please? Now I'll cover some of the scope 3 criteria introduced in the guidance. These are still specific criteria on top of the general criteria. I will talk about 3 criteria, which is purchase intermediate product, such as purchase hot briquette iron, and sole intermediate product, such as surplus coke, and also upstream fuel and energy related emissions. Next. I would also like to highlight one of the recommendations for the upstream ferroalloys production emissions. Next slide, please. The core boundary, as explained by Rafael, has certain implication when companies do not carry out all the activities within the boundary themselves. Company may purchase some intermediate products such as iron in various form or coke rather than producing themselves. In these cases, the emission associated with producing this intermediate product, which would normally be classified as scope 3, must be included within the core boundary of the target set by the steelmaker. Company will need to include at least 95% of upstream emissions for this purchase intermediate product within the core boundary, regardless of if this emission is about 40% threshold or 60% scope 3 coverage. And secondary emission data is acceptable, but we will encourage company to use primary data. Next slide, please. For sole intermediate products, some iron and steel making companies that have surplus of intermediate product and sell them to other steel and iron and steel companies, the process used to transform this intermediate product into hot rolled steel fall under the iron and steel core boundary. These products include coke, iron ore pellet or sinter, HBI or pig iron, or any form of crude steel like billet sold for hot rolling. If company is using the iron and steel SDA for its own activities, they must include at least 95% of downstream emissions associated with the further processing of this intermediate product into hot rolled steel by another company. While including further processing emissions is mandatory, expanding the activity is not. Company can choose not can opt to simply add the further processing emissions to this emission inventory without adjusting the activity, the tonnage, to hot rolled steel. That means the intensity will be higher. Next slide, please. Outside the core boundary, they are responsible for significant emissions. Here we have found that there is one source of emission that is very important, and so we decided to make it mandatory. This is methane emission from extraction of fossil fuel. Therefore, we require scope 3 target covering upstream fuel and energy related emissions, including extraction of iron ore, natural gas, or metallurgical coal, etc. Given the challenge around obtaining data from these emissions, this target is kept separate from the core boundary, from the core target. in order not to weaken the robustness of the core target. We hope that by including this target will support increased data availability. So more company will have to report this. Next slide, please. Ferroalloy production is excluded from the core boundary. This producer will have a different emission profile than carbon steel producer. High alloy steel producer can use the steel pathway for their steel making, and it is recommended to set a Scope 3 target covering emission of the ferroalloy production using any of the Scope 3 methodology. This is not a criteria, it is a recommendation. Okay, next slide, please. Upstream company. These two slides summarize the guidance of upstream and downstream companies, either supplying raw material for steelmaking or using the steel product. They would normally need to cover steelmaking emission as part of their Scope 3, and this guidance will describe how. For upstream suppliers, we distinguish between those intermediate products that are almost used for steelmaking, such as iron ore, and those that may not be, such as hydrogen production. Next, please. Okay. For iron ore supplier, they can set their Scope 3 Category 10 processing of sole product target using the iron and steel target setting tool, which is this one, by clicking the iron and steel tool tab at the bottom there. The ambition is 1.5, and entering the activities in tonnage, entering the activities in tonnage of hot rolled steel and the emission. Next, or by using the cross sector, they have a tool and inputting data in the Scope 3 tool tab. The company have a choice of different Scope 3 method. We can be well below 2 or 1.5, which are absolute reduction, 2.5% annual reduction, physical intensity, economic intensity, or supply engagement. For hydrogen producer, on the other hand, hydrogen is considered a sector agnostic product, so they cannot use the iron and steel, company cannot use iron and steel SDA unless they can show that the product they sell are solely used for iron and steel making. Otherwise, they should use other Scope 3 methods. Next slide, please. Likewise, for downstream company, emissions from manufacturing of steel may be relevant source of Scope 3 emission for company in other sectors, such as automotives and construction value chain. Next, in the steel target setting tool, company can use the steel SDA for steel purchaser option in this steel procurement tool, within the tool there, for their Scope 3 target setting, where the emission concerns are from the steel and occur inside the core boundary. Next. Or company can use other Scope 3 method using the cross-sector tool, which is either well below 2 or 1.5, with all the different methods that I mentioned before. In summary, the steel target setting tool, it is intended for company to set intensity target for processes occurring within the core boundary. For those processes outside the core boundary, please use the cross-sector setting tool. Next slide, please. A few resources are available on the steel website to help companies set the SBTs. This includes the steel guidance and the steel target setting tool. I hope you have already looked at them and tried using the tool. And also we accompany this with the worked examples document to guide company to develop target according to the guidance, and also have recommendation on the target wordings. Next slide, please. These are the target setting submission process. If company decided to set the SBTs, register online and submit their standard commitment letter. Next. Once companies submit their commitment letter, they have up to 2 years to develop the target. Previously committed steel company to submit, they also have 24 months to submit the target. They must use the new guidance if they want to submit the target after it came into force. Next. At present, we have a 4-month waiting period for the target validation team to review your submission. We offer 5 validation slots for company interested in setting targets, and we still have 2 slots that is open for company who would like to join this pilot phase. Okay. Please contact our project team if you are interested in taking up this slot. Company will need to fill in the standard target setting form and the steel annex, which are available on the steel website. So this brings to the end of my presentation. I will hand over back to Emily for the next section. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. And actually, that is the majority of the content that we have for you today. But before diving into the Q&A session, and thank you so much for sending in all your questions, let's open our final poll. So we want to know what is the area you are most interested in with regards to the steel science-based target setting guidance. So we'll give this a minute or two, and I just want to thank everyone for sending in all these interesting questions before and during the webinar. Somebody has requested to get more like written answers on some of these questions, and we will be working towards producing an FAQ document that will help to address a lot of the questions that are asked today. And yeah, so let's see what the results are. Great. So majority of people want to know majority of you want to know, and understand, how to apply the science-based target setting for the steel industry, which is great. And yeah, excellent. So let's move on to the questions. And let's see, the first question, I think this is a very interesting one. Maybe Rafael can help us out on this. Why do you use 2 different pathways, meaning having a different pathway for primary steel making and secondary or scrap-based steel making? Does this not just allow primary steel makers to continue to have a much higher emissions and maintain the status quo?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think this is a really good question. So if you take a look at the emission trajectory, the emission density trajectory, 100% ore-based producers end up at 29% reduction by 2030, while scrap-based producers end up at around 25% reduction, if I recall the number correctly, which means that generally the push is there for the ore-based producers to decarbonize, and the closer they move to the scrap-based target, to the scrap-based line via using more scrap, the easier their target becomes. And the difference doesn't sound large by 2030, but when you take a look at the trajectory beyond 2030, it actually gets much steeper for the ore-based producers. So we believe that it is a feasible pathway for the sector to follow.
Great, thank you.
Can I maybe add a little bit onto that? I think just one clarification that it's worth people keeping in mind. So what science-based targets do is they say how quickly companies should be reducing their emissions. So they're about forward-looking ambition. They're not about assessing a company's performance today. So we're not saying whether a company is in the right place today or not. We're saying that both ore-based producers and secondary-based producers need to reduce emissions by these given rates. That's the important thing to say. And then the second one, I just saw a question in the chat that I think is worth covering here. Does this mean that we're somehow disincentivizing the use of scrap? No, I wouldn't say that's the case, because you'll always be kind of incentivized to use more scrap or to move towards scrap-based steel making to a certain extent with this methodology, because you'll always have more levers to reduce your emissions in that type of steel making. And as Rafael was just saying, the curve for the secondary producers is actually flatter. So as you move towards it, you actually get a more lenient target.
Great. Thank you for that add-on comment, Carl. So let's see. So another question, I think maybe Rafael, you can try to answer this one as also. Why does the core boundary not align exactly with other systems?
Yes, so I believe that was already answered during the presentation, but in general, these different guidances, different organizations have different goals. So some of them tackle sector-wide emissions, some of them tackle product-level emissions. We opted for company/sector level emissions, and that allowed us to maybe discard or like move some of the emission sources, such as cold rolling and coating, outside the boundary. Of course, it does not mean that SBTi does not care about these emissions. If they are material enough, then other methodologies apply to them. So it's not like they are left forgotten. It's just that we believe that they do not have to be accounted for in the steel boundary, and thus we wanted to reduce a little bit the reporting burden on the companies.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, so the next question I think is quite a common question, or something that a lot of people are wondering about. Carl, maybe you can help us out here. So are CCS and CCU included in the guidance?
Yeah, so in this guidance, we don't say anything specifically about these because this will be a cross-sector topic, but to give you an idea of the SBTi position, so carbon capture and storage, where we mean permanent geological storage, yes, that counts as an emission reduction towards meeting your target, whereas carbon capture and use is more of an open question still. And I would say the greenhouse gas accounting guidance hasn't really been finalized on this, whether some kinds of use where it's more permanent would be included as an emission reduction, whereas other types of use, which is less permanent, where there's an emission quite soon, might not be included or would be considered more like an avoided emission or an emission reduction shared between two different parties. Those are still open questions, so we don't answer them here. Don't forget that this is about target setting. So we still have everything we need to know for companies to set targets. As to how carbon capture and use can help them meet targets, that's a question still to be answered in the future, I think.
Okay, great. I think the next question, maybe Brenda can help us out because it's something to do with the methodology. So what do you see are the limitations or gaps that the steel guidance have not addressed yet? And how often is the SBTi planning to review this methodology?
The question. We would love to include the upstream methane emission into the core boundary, as it is an important emission that needs to be captured. Because of the data availability on the upstream emission is not sufficiently robust, it would be really risky to adjust the boundary and also the carbon budget. So that's why we make it as a separate mandatory target. Hopefully, it may support the increased data availability when more companies are reporting their emissions. As data on these upstream emissions will likely to improve in the next few years, then we might think of an update to review the ambition level, in the future.
Great, thank you. And I think this data availability is always, a challenge for emissions accounting and target setting as well. So I think the next question, maybe Carl can help with this. How often does the SBTi intend to review the methodology if there is new data from the IEA?
So yeah, of course, IEA, which is what we base our carbon budgets on, they update their data periodically. We took the decision here, and we tend to do this to rely on a kind of flagship report from the IEA, so the IEA net zero by 2050, rather than having to continually update. So we hope that this means that the guidance and the pathway remains static, at least for a number of years, so that companies can use it and not have unexpected changes. Of course, the commitment to review based on the methane question is one exception perhaps to that Brenda has just mentioned, but otherwise we would try to keep the pathways and the guidance relatively static. But in the future, of course, when IEA data changes significantly, we would have to update.
Great, thank you. I think the next question, maybe Carl, you can help us out as well. Like, how is regionality being taken into account in developing the methodology, especially for emerging economies where growth and support for decarbonization may differ?
Yeah, so we get this question a lot. I often divide regionality into three reasons why there might be differences. The first one is there might be technology differences between regions. The second one is that the political support for decarbonization might be different. And the third one is that growth rate might be different. So the first one on technology difference, our methodology actually takes this very well into account. As I explained before, the convergence method means a company's starting emissions are taken into account, and the technology should be converging everywhere to a similar emission intensity. So that's well taken into account. So we don't need differentiated carbon intensity pathways for that reason. The second one is about political support or political context. What we would answer to that is that we don't take this into account. Companies in regions where maybe there's less political support should be using the fact that they're setting science-based targets as a way to show their governments that they would like to see change and to lobby for the support that they need. And then the third question is about growth, different growth rates around the world. This is one we've thought a lot about, and in fact, our research team is looking at it. But for the moment, we don't see an objective way that we could change our methodologies to allow for this, especially in the case of steel, which is a globally traded commodity. So it would be difficult to say that just because one region is projecting higher growth, that that's all for that region. So for the moment, our methodologies will stay as they are, and I think they will stay like that for the foreseeable future. But it is a question that we've been looking at to see if there's anything that we could change.
Great, thank you. So we have three more minutes left. We'll try our best to answer more questions. If you have questions, please just put it in a Q&A, and we will try our best to, answer them in some way in the future. But let's look at more questions here. I think this is an interesting one. Why is the pathway for steel less steep than for other sectors? Carl, maybe you can help with this one.
Yeah. So we get most of our carbon budget information from the IEA, and the IEA's modeling, they're kind of dividing up the remaining carbon budget that we have between different sectors based on the technology and levers they have to reduce emissions and the cost that they have. So the budget allocated to different sectors actually depends on this balance between all the sectors. And that gives us our upper limit of what the budget can be. And for sectors such as steel, this is effectively a larger budget or a slower decarbonization rate than society as a whole because of the high processes, high temperature and process emissions, etc., linked to this sector. So that's why we feel it is justified to have a sector-specific method that is less steep.
Okay. I think there is also a very quick question around, are we talking about CO2 emissions or CO2 equivalent as well?
We're talking about CO2 equivalent. So all of the Kyoto gases that goes across the SBTi, and that is of course relevant in this particular case where we might, for example, be wanting to include methane emissions upstream. We will be expressing them also in CO2 equivalent. Okay,
great. So we have a minute left. So I want to focus on something that maybe is more forward-looking. Carl, I think it's back to you again, because, this is something that maybe you can give some insight on. What is the next step for the steel guidance?
So the guidance is in place and we don't expect it to change in terms of content. We would like companies to be setting targets. And as Brenda mentioned, we're already inviting the first companies to set targets. You may have seen recently announced that the SBTi is undergoing something of a transformation in terms of becoming a standard setter, which means we're formalizing many of our processes, and what we call guidance today may be called standards in future. So that probably will mean an update for the steel guidance to become a standard, but I don't anticipate the content to change. So the obligations on companies will actually remain the same, notwithstanding what I said earlier about periodic changes to the data, which might come later. So we expect an update to become a standard, but no real change for the companies.
Great. And we are on the hour. So that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking part in today's webinar. If we can show one of the final slides, I just want to say that, we'd like to call on all companies to set science-based net zero targets. And we have the new guidance and tools on the SBTi Steel webpage. Companies are also encouraged to take up, the early validation slots. If you have any questions, these slides will be shared and the contact is there. Please reach out to Amir Khan from the technical development team. And in the next slide, again, we have our presence across social media. We have emails that you can reach out to us on as well. So please don't be a stranger. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And once again, thank you for all our presenters today. And it's really good to have all of you to join us. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you.